Podot.
Welcome to the Ned Ludd Radio Hour. I'm Nick Hilton.
Welcome. You've got mail.
Before we start today, just a quick note to say that I was intending, as usual, to get this episode out this morning, first thing, and then I had this sort of very disempowering experience of having my Apple Watch stolen on the train into town, and then watching, kind of powerless, on my phone as I could see it travelling its way across London. I sort of chased for a little bit, thinking I was going to do some sort of vigilantism, and I eventually gave up and just kind of watched it. But it threw my whole schedule out of whack. So this is why this episode is coming out a little bit later than I intended it to come out. Anyway, on with the show. A few months ago, in astonishment at the ever-increasing prices of takeaway coffee here in London, I set out on a simple mission. I wanted to find somewhere in the capital that still served a £1 coffee. This didn't seem, at the time, like an especially delusional ambition. After all, what is coffee? Ground beans strained through hot water, essentially. I wasn't talking about the fancy stuff, the lattes or cappuccinos or oat milk chai flat whites dusted with turmeric and regret. I was talking about the simple stuff. Espresso, filter coffee, Americano. Bean meets water. In London, the price of coffee with foamed milk accompaniment has now broken the seal, the sacred seal, and crossed the threshold of £4 in certain places. Not everywhere, but in nice places. The absurdity of this is untampered by the fact that £3 is now a normal price for a to-go black coffee. I live in South London, near the point where the city proper meets suburbia, and the prices of coffee are noticeably cheaper. An Americano near me might be £2.50 rather than £3. But it's all still crazy to my untrained eye. Anyway, I set off on this deeply boring middle-aged man adventure, just delaying the inevitable descent into owning model train sets, a few months ago, with the ambition of finding somewhere that still thinks that a quid is an acceptable price. There were plenty of places that offered some sort of subsidised price, hospital canteens, so the coffee there is often awful and breaks my rule against it being instant coffee, or the Houses of Parliament. But even in these places, the price would still be well above the pound. This took me to McDonald's, where a coffee is notionally 99p, except that it's actually 20p more expensive than that at my nearest McDonald's, which happens to be inside a train station and therefore subject to slightly strange market pressures. But anyway, I didn't feel much accomplishment at the discovery that you could still get a 99p coffee from a McDonald's in Croydon. That wasn't the true purpose of the task, because really, who goes to McDonald's for the coffee? Which is when I came upon an unlikely venue in Soho, which in coffee terms is one of the priciest places in the city. It's called Algerian Coffee Stores, and it is primarily a vendor of ground and unground coffee beans. It is essentially a shop, a coffee shop, but not a hot coffee shop. But it also has a little coffee store inside where the prices were good. On March 7th, when I first visited, the menu was simple and the prices were as follows. Espresso, double or single, and Americano, £1. Latte cappuccino flat white, £1.50. So I had done it. I had found somewhere in central London that served good coffee at a reasonable price. The fact that their business model relied heavily upon seducing customers into buying some of the far less good value bagged coffee didn't really bother me. I could still pop in, hand over a shiny £1 coin, with the king's head on it soon, and receive a steaming cup of coffee. Just 2 months later, though, on May the 5th, I returned to find a notice apologising for price rises. Espresso and Americano were now £1.50, while the milk melange drinks were all £2. Due to increased costs, the notice announced, we have had to increase our drinks prices. We ask that you are not rude to our lovely staff regarding the increases. I bit my tongue mid-insult. After all, these are still the best prices in London, really. But it spoke to a truth that has been self-evident in the years since COVID-19, and particularly since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Supply lines that have felt unbreakable, unshakable even, have suddenly come under real pressure. What do you need in order to make a cup of coffee? You need the beans first. The biggest exporters of coffee beans in the world are Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, Indonesia, Honduras, Ethiopia, India, Uganda, Mexico, and Guatemala. If there is a theme among them, it's that they are very far from our temperate climes here in Europe, and in the large part, relatively far from other Western markets. So this necessitates immediately cross-continental transport of these precious little nuggets. But of course, I could go into any supermarket and buy a bag of coffee beans for £3, and that bag would make 20 or 30 cups. And that's not even wholesale pricing. The reality is that the cost of doing business in the real world is just frighteningly expensive. Staff costs, rent, taxes, energy prices, these are all the things that coffee shops from independent outlets in Soho to the biggest chains in the world have to grapple with. It is a tangle of costs mixed with the complexity of the chain. Which all raises the question of why I persist with the financial self-penalty of buying this extremely expensive coffee. When I mentioned this week's episode to Ned, they wrote back asking, first of all, whether it was sufficiently linked to technology. I said it was, of course. Technology has made us naive to the difficulties of building real-world products. I can get DALL-E to draw me a picture of a cup of coffee in a second, but when will AI make me a steaming mug of joe? So this is what they wrote back. A downside risk of technological dependence is mental bifurcation from the reality of manufacturing. Everyone uses computers. Few could build a computer. Fewer still could mine or smelt or polymerize these elements required to build even the shell of the intended product. The impact is starting to be seen. Devices, good devices, are becoming scarcer. The wait time's longer. Software runs on apace. Hardware remains subject to the turbulent conditions of a fractured marketplace. They're not wrong, at least in my experience. I waited the best part of 2 years before I could get hold of a PS5, which seemed like a huge market failure. But Sony are hardly the only company to be experiencing these supply chain difficulties, with Apple and Tesla and other companies reliant on China increasingly nervous. And then there are those mystical things, the rare earth minerals that sound like they've come from Minecraft or something. They're apparently vital for things like chips and batteries, the objects that will power the next 100 years. Anyway, my guest today made a chicken sandwich. It took him 6 months and cost him $1,500. Now, this wouldn't usually be cause for inviting someone onto a podcast to talk about globalization, but Andy George is no ordinary maker of chicken sandwiches. He runs a YouTube channel called How to Make Everything, which, at time of writing, has 1.74 million subscribers. Andy's premise is simple. He makes everything, but he makes it from scratch. He procures everything straight from the source and then works backwards to try and turn it into a viable product. The sort of products we become used to buying in every supermarket in the country. His most successful videos involve making chocolate, an American football, a root beer float, and a pair of glasses. His story about making a chicken sandwich, which was my point of entry to his world, has over 6 million views and went viral again recently on Twitter. Part of its appeal is, I think, a demonstration of how hard life has been for most of humanity's existence, and how much we've come to take for granted the conveniences afforded to us here in the modern age. In a moment, you'll hear my conversation with Andy, which I hope gets you thinking about some of these questions about supply chains in our globalized world, and also makes you marvel with renewed appreciation for the miracle that is human evolution. There's not a monkey in the world that can make a chicken sandwich, let alone create a mass market version for consumption by 1,000 hungry commuters every day. But humans have taken it in their stride. Anyway, here's Andy.
I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's about 11 a.m.
Okay, so you're somewhat behind us here in London. You've got the whole day ahead of you. You're the creator of kind of a hit YouTube channel, How to Make Everything, which basically is about your journeys in reverse engineering everyday products or things that we take for granted in the modern world and kind of getting back to the basic principles of production. How did you get started on this? It's quite the journey.
Yeah, I guess I was just started out being curious about where everything that we use every day comes from. For me, it started with food. And at the time, I was really getting into like cooking and kind of starting to realize like you can make stuff, you can make a dish from scratch, but like pretty much nobody's like going out and growing their own wheat and grinding it up. And just kind of realizing there's all these steps like you don't really think about every day. And it made me wonder like what would happen if you actually did every single step from plant to an animal to your meal. And well, brainstorming ideas, I found that like the sandwich is an odd kind of modern invention of something that is surprisingly complex, but so simple to make because it has so many different things in it that I doubt they were making sandwiches back in prehistoric times. And I just kind of discovered there's so many steps you don't think about, and going on that process and explored it. And it was a really fascinating journey. And after I finished the sandwich, I realized I could apply that to basically anything in everyday life, and realized like there's so much I don't know. So I just kind of started exploring everything.
So it started. The chicken sandwich was the original concept, and were you thinking this is going to not only be like an interesting examination of our reliance on supermarkets to sell us flour rather than going out and milling wheat or whatever, but were you also thinking this is going to make a really interesting YouTube video? Were you thinking about it as a sort of like social media phenomenon at that time, or were you just purely focused on like the task at hand?
Well, not really for social media, I guess, but I did go to school for filmmaking and had wanted to get into documentary filmmaking. At the time, I was just doing like advertisements, like stuff people you press skip on. So I wanted to make something people wanted to watch. So my goal was to do some sort of project that would get me into the documentary filmmaking arena. I didn't even want to be on camera at first. I just couldn't find anybody else who was willing to do all of this work. So I actually made it intended to just a short film documentary, and then ended up going through a process, tried to pitch it for TV, and ended up filming a few episodes to try and make it as a TV show to show like how it would be done, and didn't go anywhere. And then kind of reluctantly put it on YouTube, where it ended up finding its audience.
Right. And it's fair to say the chicken sandwich went viral. I mean, I saw it a few weeks ago. It was being shared on Twitter and it was going absolutely like gangbusters. And I was like, this is brilliant. This is genius. And then I realized it was, 7 years old. This has been around for ages. So it's had a huge shelf life. It keeps finding new fans. Can you talk people through the basics of the process and basically how difficult is it to make a chicken sandwich from scratch?
Yeah. So the rules were that I can't buy any of the ingredients, and I have to like source them as they're available in nature. So basically, there's things you don't expect to be as difficult as they are. I think the one that was the most surprising was salt. I was going to try and make my own pickles because it's a crucial ingredient for a sandwich. And like I lived in Minnesota, which is in the middle of a continent. There's not really a source of salt water or salt mines or anything. So I ended up having to fly out to the coast, rent a boat, go out, fill a jug, boil it down, get some salt, figure out how to explain that to TSA as I went through security, my bag of white powder, and then use that in it. So that was probably like the most expensive and complicated small ingredient that you don't really think about. But beyond that, it was just having to grow everything and then do the processing, and then processes you don't really think about, like how do you make cheese out of milk, and all of that. It was very eye-opening.
Were you just throughout this? Were you just single-minded, thinking this is going to make a really good short documentary? Or were you at times thinking, "Why am I doing this? This is way more complicated than I wanted," or was it just that every new complication made the story more compelling?
I was very uncertain about how it was going to turn out, and I think I described the project to a lot of people, and they're like, "Okay," and like they didn't really get it until I had a final video, and like, "Oh," and so it did seem like a little bit of like just going down my own rabbit hole of insanity of, yeah, I'm going to fly to LA to get some salts that you could just buy at a store for a few cents. And I don't know. I think it was just once I committed to it, I was like, I'm going to see this through, and whatever happens with it happens.
And then there's this moment at the end of the video where you bite into the sandwich and you eat it for the first time, and you say, yeah, it's fine. Was that bathos, that sort of anticlimactic ending, was that what you were expecting? Were you sort of aware going through it that maybe the sandwich wasn't going to be stunning?
I think kind of the original idea or curiosity was like homemade cooking is always better. Like, what if you went all the way? Like, it should be even greater. It should be like the best sandwich ever made. So that was my initial thought. I think by the end, like everything was felt like it was falling apart. Like the vegetables I picked were starting to rot. My wheat was just not quite dry enough. So I didn't even know if it was ready to be ground. And it was like, I don't know if I'm going to get a sandwich out of this after all this work. So then at that point, I was just like happy to have something. Like I had something to look like a sandwich and was at least edible. So at that point, I was satisfied to just reach something. But I think along the way, I realized that I'm not doing this like as a seasoned professional would. Like this isn't quite going to be the best sandwich ever.
So then you released the chicken sandwich video and out on YouTube, and it kind of went out into the world. And did you realize quite quickly that there was a tribe on the internet of people who were very interested in this sort of idea, for whom it scratched some sort of intellectual itch to see someone doing this sort of back to basics engineering projects of like everyday items? How quickly did it emerge that there was a real audience for this?
I think early on when I started, like whenever I told people about it, I kept running into people who are like, "Oh yeah, I had an idea similar to that." So I was kind of had an inkling that like this is kind of something some people are interested in. There's probably some sort of audience, but it wasn't until it went viral that I realized there's a lot of people who find this at least curious enough to click on. So that was very affirming, I think, to just discover how wide of an audience I could find.
And do you have a sense of where the audience was coming from? Was it coming from the artist formerly known as Twitter, or was it a Reddit phenomenon? Do you know where the kind of the biggest social media push was coming from?
Yeah, it was definitely Reddit because that's where I actually posted it myself, just on a whim, and that was what gave it the initial traction. But I remember watching it that day and just like it taking off, and then like just kind of spreading everywhere, and other websites posting it, and a fun phenomenon to watch.
Right. And when you launched Chicken Sandwich, did you have the difficult second album? Was that already done? Did you have another video ready to go, or did you have to then think, okay, this one's works, what else is going to work?
So like I said, I had kind of tried to make this a TV show before. So I had like a whole, like, I think it was 8-episode season we had made. Some other people helped me. And so then we had other content. The challenge was that the content's not easy to produce. Like the sandwich took over 6 months. Then like I did the suit, and that took over a year, I think. And so we had some initial content, but then the challenge has always been like, how do you keep producing? Because YouTube is like, you're supposed to keep producing content to have like a real career there. So that's honestly still trying to figure that out, of like how to do projects that take multiple months and produce content that's weekly or bi-weekly or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And of all the things you've done over the years now, what's been your personal favorite, and maybe what's been the hardest, the most like exhausting process?
My usual go-to for my favorite project was chocolate, and I think I just like hit the right combination of like a process I've never really thought about before I took it on, and something that was just delicious the entire way through. Because before that, I didn't know that like it's a fruit that grows on a tree, and there's just a whole fermenting process and drying and all these steps that never knew about. I just eat chocolate and yeah, so that was fascinating and delicious in the end. I think my most challenging I recently revisited was I was doing a larger project of trying to make my own camera from scratch, and one of the big first steps of that was making a camera lens and grinding. Well, first making optically clear glass, which has been like a multi-year process of figuring out how to make glass that actually turns out clear. Because making glass is kind of simple. Making it actually clear that you can make lenses and stuff out of is very difficult, as I found. But then grinding it to the right amount and getting a quality result has been a challenge that I'm still working out some of the flaws in.
Were you always like this? Were you always someone who was good with their hands, very practical? Were you always someone who wanted to experiment and build stuff? I mean, or is this something you've learned through the process of making your show?
That's something I had like in me from the beginning, I guess, to some extent. Of like, I always like to build things and tinker, and was obsessed with Legos and Connects growing up. But I think it's definitely been kind of a rabbit hole of digging deeper into that aspect of myself, and taking on projects that I never would have even considered doing before I started this series.
And when we think about the way that those videos have gone viral and the community of people, whether it's on Reddit or elsewhere who've really engaged with the show that you're making, what do you think the resonance is? Is this just something that people see as a sort of fascinating, oh, look, interesting, that's how that's done, look how difficult it is? Do you think people enjoy seeing your the sweat and blood, sweat and tears? Or do you think there is also an element of kind of psychological desire to kind of better understand the world that we live in?
I don't know. I think probably both. I just enjoy the process of kind of tackling a new topic every time because there's always aspects you don't think about or understand. So my personal enjoyment is always with covering a new area that I don't know and
Mm.
learning it hands on.
And do you get like artisans in various industries contacting you to be like, to say all of these skills that have seemingly been lost over the years and have been replaced by all this machinized and sort of consumer capitalism at its most global? Do you get people contacting you being like, you're a great showcase for how stuff can be actually made from scratch, or is it just a sort of curiosity thing?
I mean, it's on YouTube, so a lot of the people who contact me who have experience in that are telling me everything I did wrong.
Okay.
But along the way, I try to like reach out to experts in the different fields and talk to them, and it's always fascinating to hear like what they're passionate about and like these kind of lost arts that most people aren't really doing too much today. But there's
Mm.
usually somebody who's still keeping it alive. It's always really fascinating to tap their mind.
So do you feel like ultimately for you this is a project that it feels like to me from our conversation it is mainly about, what, it's really interesting, it makes an interesting TV show, it's good entertainment, but do you think there is a sense that maybe people have lost touch with how complicated everyday devices are, how many different supply chains are involved in even a chicken sandwich involves so many different supply chains, so many different industries working in tandem. And I think we then see, supply shocks like the COVID pandemic or the war in Ukraine. And suddenly we realize how fragile everything that our society is built on. What's your kind of learnings about kind of this state of our over reliance, or I shouldn't, I'm leading the witness by saying over reliance, but our reliance on all these different supply chains. What's it taught you?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a product of just like modern life is that it's gotten so complex that no nobody even unless you stop to think about it, nobody like realizes how much work goes into all of it. And I think like the supply chain stuff like kind of showed that like there's some cracks in the system and it can cause a lot of problems. So it's like I think it's very useful to keep all of this knowledge alive and accessible while understanding that like we have much better ways of doing this than spending 6 months growing a sandwich. But if those processes break down, it's nice to know like how you can kind of fill in the gaps on your own.
Yeah. Your video didn't convince me that I wanted to build a water mill in my garden in order to, provide energy for my house. I mean, it certainly suggests there are better ways of doing things. So what's next? Do you have is there, obviously you've talked about the camera, is there like a end product? Is there the kind of final thing that you think would round off your adventure in this space? Being like, if you could, I don't know, build an iPhone from scratch, or are you just kind of like going to go from one thing to another and see where the adventure takes you?
Yeah, I mean, the goal is just kind of keep going and like see how far I can get. But kind of the big milestone I've put is kind of reaching my own industrial revolution. I've been working my way up through different technologies. I just built like a water wheel and figuring out how to use that to power different things. So getting like an actual steam engine that's up and running, I think it would be like a pretty cool milestone. But I definitely would like to keep going past that and see how far I can get. The camera project is definitely like a big, just personal goal. I think just like as someone who's creating video content, that like
Mhm.
I would love to be able to make my own video camera that I can actually film the video with and like my own microphone to record it and like have a video literally made from scratch.
Right. And in terms of the future of the show, I mean, you've got almost 2 million viewers on YouTube, which seems an unfathomably large number to me. Does that mean you can focus on doing this full time? This is your 9 to 5 job, or are you hustling other things too? I don't know how the finances of them work.
Yeah, this is pretty much my full time job for the past several years. And has been kind of a fun journey to be able to just dive right into this.
And there must have been interest for an adaptation for TV at this point. Someone must have seen how many people are watching these videos and thought, you know what, that would be a great Nat Geo TV series or whatever. Is that something you'd still be keen on?
I'm definitely open to it. I did end up shooting a pilot with the Food Network at one point that didn't end up going anywhere, which is just kind of how that TV industry goes. That makes me a little less interested in it, just because it's so fickle that I could potentially get like a TV series and maybe it run for 1 year, or I could do YouTube and I can just kind of keep doing this for however long I want.
And do it how you want to do it. And just,
exactly.
When it's ready, it's ready. Like the chicken sandwich.
Yeah.
The Ned Ludd Radio Hour is a Podot podcast written and presented by me, Nick Hilton. The theme music is Internet Song by Apes of the State, who are the sort of apes who probably could make a chicken sandwich, used with their generous permission. The artwork is by Tom Humberstone. For socials, go to nedluddlives.com and spread the word. And do, if you like this, go to Apple or Spotify and leave a rating and review, 5 stars preferably. If you don't like it, just move on with your lives. Nothing to see here. But yes, that would be helpful. Thank you. Till next week.